Elizabeth Acevedo. Elizabeth Acevedo is not your typical household name. She's awfully famous, though. Going into this MIT piece, I had no idea who she was, so I thought it was very cool learning about her. Elizabeth is a slam poet and the author of the novel Poet X. She began poetry at the age of 8 and said that she learned poetry before she even knew how to write. Her goal was to become a performer, which she accomplished, but she wanted to be a rapper initially. It didn't work out. She found slam poetry after her rapping career went nowhere, and she started to fall in love with it. Acevedo loves the idea of storytelling, and in many ways, her slam poetry is exactly that. Elizabeth began her biggest writing journey in 2012, though, when she started to write her most famous piece, Poet X. When Acevedo made the novel Poet X, it was more than just a book to her. Her reasoning behind creating the book was absolutely amazing. Back when she was a teacher in Maryland in 2012, she would read poetry to her class. Acevedo's class was 90% Latino, and her students would ask her, "Why isn't anyone like us in the stories that we read?" She didn't have an answer, but she soon understood that the stories she was telling her students weren't actually ending up on their bookshelves at home. Her purpose for writing Poet X is to have all people fit in and not feel discriminated against. The fact of not having any Latinos in the stories the kids were reading was hurting them, and Acevedo noticed, and it drove her to create Poet X. It took her a long time to finally finish writing Poet X, because she was teaching slam poetry, and she worked on a few manuscripts while working on Poet X. While she was writing the other manuscripts, she really noticed that what she was doing wasn't worthwhile, because the story she really needed to tell was about finding your own voice. It sounds like this was her most important piece she's ever done to her. She doesn't come out and say it, but her passion for it is incredible. Acevedo's Poet X had a bigger impact on people's lives than you can imagine. In many ways, it changed lives and made people feel more accepted. The little Latino girls that asked Acevedo why people like them aren't in any stories are finally in a story. That was something that bugged them now, and she made it a mission to fix that, not just that generation, but for future ones to come. It was a movement of promoting more people of color to be used in stories and poetry. As I said before, Acevedo found that in her life writing Poet X, she really found that the story she needed to tell the most was about finding your own voice. That is something very important in my eyes, and I'm sure many of yours as well. Finding your own voice means more than you think when you really tear it apart and evaluate that phrase. It means voicing your opinions, justifying your actions, doing things for people who physically can't, and being a leader for people who may not have found their voices yet. That's Acevedo's biggest message in her story. It's to find your own voice. Along with voice, I found it interesting that Acevedo mentioned that she wants readers to step out of their comfort zone. Elizabeth says that we should all know our interests and what we like to read, but we should also step out of our comfort zone and hear a voice that we may have never heard. She promotes hearing a voice you never heard because you can learn we are all sometimes more similar than we know. Acevedo says, we can be from different cities and different cultures, but ultimately we have a lot more that unites us. Teaching is not community service. This quote speaks volume. It shows us that we don't need to feel like it's work teaching someone else. We should want to enlighten others on things we knew or things we are trying to promote. Learning is a lifelong endeavor, and it shouldn't be looked at as a negative. This was my favorite quote throughout my time researching Acevedo. When in graduate school, Elizabeth was told to write an ode about an animal. An ode is a poem praising something. Acevedo chose a rat because she was from New York City and she has had many experiences with rats. The professor laughed at her and said, "A rat is not a noble enough creature to write a poem about." He told Elizabeth she needs more experiences in her life. That really spoke to her. It hurt in a way. It did not just affect Acevedo in that classroom, in that rat ode, but it also made her want to prove that professor wrong. She wanted more experiences. Acevedo wrote this piece about the rat and named it the Rat Ode. It is a very interesting poem, It makes you look at rats in a whole new light.
Because you are not the admired nightingale. Because you are not the noble doe. Because you are not the picturesque ermine, armadillo, or bat. They have been written. And I don't know their song like I know your scuttling between walls. The scent of your collapsed corpse rotting beneath floorboards. Your frantic squeal as you pull at your own fur from glue traps, ripping flesh from skin in an attempt to survive. Because in July of 97, you birthed a legion on 109th, swarmed from behind the dumpsters, made our streets infamous for something other than crack. Shoot, we nicknamed you Cat Killer. Raced with you through open hydrants, squeaked like you when Siete blasted aluminum back into your brethren's skull. The sound slapped down dominoes. You reigned that summer rack. And even when they sent exterminators, half dead and on fire, you pushed on. Because even though you are an inelegant, simple, mammal bottom feeder, always freaking famished, little ugly thing who feasts on what crumbs fall from the corners of our mouths, you live uncuddled, uncoddled, can't be bought at Petco and fed to fat snakes because you are not the maze rat of labs, pale, pretty-eyed, trained. You raise yourself, sharp fang, clawed, scarred, patched dark because of this. He should love you. But look at the beast, the professor tells me. The table is already full, and rat, you are not a right-worthy thing. Every time they say that, take your gutter, your dirt coat, filth this page, rat. Scrape your underbelly against streets, concrete. You better squeak and raise the whole world, rat. Let loose a plague of words, rat. And remind them that you, that I, we are worthy of every poem. Here.
Elizabeth made it a point that there was no topic too ugly or too small to write about. And it made her till this day remember what her professor said to her. And it always keeps a chip on her shoulder. Acevedo was a firm believer in equality, as we all should be. She experienced racial inequality and being judged because of the color of her skin. I think this rat ode showed her as a human being. She's even fighting for the equality of a rat, and to show that because it's not a noble creature, it still fights for life every day, and lives and has a life. The rat ode was more than a shot back at the professor. It was Elizabeth telling the world that you shouldn't judge something because of a stereotype or of other people's judgments. Elizabeth is a voice for equality, and she preaches it throughout her slam poetry and her storytelling. She is Dominican, and something fascinating that she said was that in the Dominican Republic, straight hair is something of value, elegance, and sophistication. As you can see, Acevedo has curly hair, and she had to straighten it every day to fit in. She was always judged, even in her country of birth, because of inequality. She uses her voice, that she wants everyone to have, for the better. She uses her voice to show us her story, to show us how there really is discrimination in everything we look at. Elizabeth married a black American man, and when she told her parents that, they asked, "What about the hair?" Now, raised in the Dominican, like I said, they love straight hair, and the fact of her mother asking that hurt her. It's something that is frowned upon to have curly hair. Just because the mother was now living in the United States did not mean it stopped her old views. She wasn't trying to be malicious, but it still hurt Acevedo. An innocent question that can be taken wrong based on history. Acevedo said, "We all carry prejudice in us, and it's our job to work on it every day, because the society we live in breeds us to have prejudice. We are all equals, and that is Elizabeth Acevedo's biggest message and story that she tells."